You've probably seen the term immigration parole popping up all over the news lately. But what on earth does it actually mean? Well, it turns out it's this incredibly powerful and, yeah, deeply controversial tool that's sitting right at the heart of the U.S. immigration debate. Today, we're going to break down exactly what it is and why it's become such a major flashpoint.
Right? It shows up in just about every conversation about the border, about refugee crises, about executive orders. But what is really happening when someone is paroled into the United States? Is it some kind of special visa? A fast track to citizenship? Let's get into it.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll nail down the basics. Then, we'll trace how this law has changed over the last 70 years. We'll look at some real-world programs, dig into the core of the debate, and finally, we'll connect all the dots to show you why this one legal idea has become so critical right now. All right, first things first. Before we get into the controversy, let's just establish a solid foundation. What are we really talking about when we say immigration parole? Okay, at its core, parole is a judgment call. Think of it like an official, temporary permission slip, not a permanent visa. And the key words to lock in here are temporary, urgent humanitarian reasons, and significant public benefit. Those are the specific legal justifications the government is supposed to use. Now, it's just as important to understand what parole is not. Being paroled into the country is not the same thing as being formally admitted. It's not a green card. It doesn't put someone on a direct path to citizenship. Legally speaking, a person on parole is still considered an applicant for admission, which basically means their status is temporary and it can be taken away. And this whole concept isn't new. The power to grant parole has been around for decades, but the rules of the game have changed a lot. It really reflects this constant tug of war between Congress and the executive branch over who controls immigration. You can actually see that push and pull right here on this timeline. It all started back in 1952 with the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, which gave the executive branch a really broad power for emergent reasons. Then, in 1980, Congress tried to narrow it with the Refugee Act. But the biggest shift by far came in 1996. A huge Immigration Reform Act added that super strict case-by-case requirement and the urgent humanitarian standard we hear so much about. And it keeps evolving. A 2025 law, the Laken-Riley Act, now gives states a direct way to sue the federal government over how it uses parole. This side-by-side really makes the shift crystal clear. The language went from something pretty flexible, emergent reasons, to something much more specific, urgent humanitarian reasons. And critically, Congress added that one little phrase, only on a case-by-case basis. Honestly, the interpretation of those 5 words is at the absolute center of the political and legal firestorm today.
So that's the law on paper, but how does it actually play out in the real world? This isn't just some dusty theoretical power. It's being used on a massive, massive scale.
Just look at this number. In fiscal year 2023 alone, the Department of Homeland Security granted parole over 1.3 million times. I mean, that's staggering. It shows how a tool that was maybe once meant for really specific individual situations has now become a central part of the U.S. immigration system. So, who's using this power the most? Well, here's the breakdown. Of those 1.3 million, the overwhelming majority, we're talking over 1.2 million, were issued by Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. And this is a really big deal because it shows that parole isn't just for people applying from overseas anymore. It's now a primary tool being used to manage the flow of people arriving directly at the U.S. border. But beyond the border, we see entire programs built around the idea of parole, all with different justifications. You've got humanitarian programs responding to global crises, like Uniting for Ukraine. You've got programs designed for family reunification, like those for Cubans and Haitians. And you even have programs based on significant public benefit, like bringing in international entrepreneurs who might start a business and create jobs. It just shows you how flexible and how powerful this authority can be. And that flexibility, that power, brings us right to the heart of the fight. If you create a program for an entire group of people, can you really say you're doing it on a case-by-case basis, like the law demands? And believe me, this is not a new argument. We can go all the way back to 1996, when Congress was actually changing the law. This was their main concern. The very committee that wrote the case-by-case rule was worried that parole was becoming a kind of backdoor immigration system for whole categories of people, not just for unique individual emergencies. But here's the counter-argument, and it's one that administrations from both parties have used. They say, look, you can create a program for a specific group as long as every single person in that program still gets an individual review. The key to their argument is that even if people are part of a larger group, the final decision is still being made one person at a time. This quote from 2019 really sharpens the criticism. The argument here is that these big parole programs are basically an executive branch workaround, a way to create a parallel immigration system that lets people just bypass the long visa lines and legal limits that were set up by Congress.
And that brings us right up to this very moment. Recent executive orders are taking direct aim at these large-scale programs, what they call categorical programs, like the one for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. The orders direct agencies to shut them down and get back to a much, much stricter reading of that case-by-case rule. This is the legal and political battlefield where this is all playing out right now.
So let's tie this all together. Why should you care about this one kind of obscure section of immigration law? Well, because it touches on some of the biggest, most fundamental questions in our entire national conversation. It really boils down to these four things. It's a fight over executive power versus the authority of Congress. It's a practical debate about the best way to manage the border. It's a huge legal argument over what a 70-year-old law is actually supposed to mean today. And for the people involved, it can be life-changing, because even though parole itself is temporary, it can sometimes open a door to apply for permanent status later on. So on one hand, you have proponents who see parole as an absolutely essential and flexible tool. From this point of view, it's a critical safety valve. It lets the government respond to unpredictable world events, manage the border in an orderly fashion, and allow people to support themselves legally while they're here. But on the other hand, critics see a massive overreach of executive power. They argue that using parole on this huge scale is not what the law was ever designed for, and that it effectively creates a parallel immigration system that just ignores the rules and limits that were carefully put in place by Congress.
At the end of the day, the debate over immigration parole isn't just about immigration. It's about a fundamental tension baked into our system of government. It forces us to ask a really tough question. In a world of constant change and constant crises, how do we balance the need for a president to act quickly with the constitutional authority of Congress to write the laws? There are no easy answers here, and how we solve this puzzle is going to shape American policy for years to come.